The moment the police drew their guns on my 16-year-old son while he was placing flowers on his brother's grave was the last thing I ever expected. 1 second, Elijah was kneeling beside the flag-draped box in our garden, his hand trembling as he placed the first bouquet of wildflowers on the grave of his fallen brother. The next second, a commanding voice shouted, "Get on the ground!" And suddenly, half a dozen officers swarmed in, their weapons aimed at Elijah as if we were in the middle of a drug bust. Why? Because our neighbor Karen had called the cops on us, reporting a suspicious boy with a shovel and weapon performing some sort of cult-like ceremony on HOA property. What she didn't know, what she didn't even care to ask, was that this wasn't some random backyard ritual. This was the burial of my eldest son, Matthew, a decorated veteran who died overseas. And to make things even worse, the woman standing just a few feet away, holding back tears, was none other than the United States Attorney General, me. That was Karen's last and biggest mistake. It all started 2 weeks earlier when I made the decision to bury my son, Matthew, on our own land. Our family has lived on this property for generations, long before the HOA bought up the neighboring lots and constructed their cookie-cutter homes. Our 5-acre plot of land had been legally designated as a private burial site decades ago. One of those old Southern rules that Karen either didn't understand or, frankly, didn't care to research. Matthew's final wish was simple: to be laid to rest beneath the oak tree he had climbed as a boy with his younger brother. It was a private ceremony, just the close family, a chaplain, a folded flag, and an honor song playing softly from a speaker. Elijah, dressed in Matthew's old scout jacket with the sleeves hanging too long, stepped forward to honor his brother. He whispered a few words, kissed the wooden box, and knelt down to place a bouquet of wildflowers on Matthew's grave. But that's when Karen's shrill voice cut through the quiet of our private moment. "What is going on here?" she screamed from the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn. Her arms were crossed, and her eyebrows were raised so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "You can't just bury people wherever you feel like it. This is HOA land." I remained calm, explaining once again that our property was federally registered and exempt from HOA regulations. But Karen wasn't listening. She never did. Instead, she saw a grieving son and decided it was a threat to her precious property value. Just 15 minutes later, while we stood silently around Matthew's resting place, flashing lights appeared at the end of the driveway. A line of patrol cars rolled in as if we were the center of some massive standoff. My heart dropped when I saw the officers reach for their guns and heard the sharp command, "On the ground! Hands where I can see them!" Elijah froze, his eyes widened in terror, his hands shaking as they hovered in the air. In that moment, every instinct inside me screamed to protect my child. Though I was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country, in that instant, I was just a mother, watching her son being treated like a criminal. I stepped forward slowly, steadying myself. I pulled out my badge, the one that had never left my side since I took my oath, and said, "I'm Marianne Rivera, United States Attorney General. Stand down." The lead officer's face went pale as he processed my words, like he just realized he had stepped into a situation far beyond what he was prepared for. His eyes shifted nervously between me and the swarm of officers still aiming their guns at my son. Karen, standing across the driveway, was grinning like she had just caught someone double parking. She was recording the entire scene on her phone, smirking, as if she'd just scored a small victory. "She's lying! That badge is fake!" Karen shouted, her voice shrill. "Anyone can order one of those online." I stood firm, every inch of my being filled with the weight of who I was and the duty I carried. But the officers, unsure of what to do, began to shift. One of them quietly pulled his partner aside and muttered something that made the lead officer's eyes widen. Within seconds, the entire atmosphere shifted. The officers slowly backed away, no longer aiming their guns at Elijah. Elijah, still shaking from the terrifying encounter, sat up, his hands trembling. He looked at me, confusion and fear still clouding his eyes. But in that moment, I knew he was safe. The officers, seeing the situation was de-escalating, turned toward Karen, who immediately shifted her tone. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," she chirped, her voice syrupy sweet, trying to play the innocent victim. "There are rules, you know." "Yes, there are," I replied, my voice steady. And as the chief enforcer of federal law, I intend to use every single one of them. Later that afternoon, after making sure Elijah was safe and settled inside, I walked down the property line. I had my camera in hand and was ready to document everything. I had already noticed something disturbing. Karen had installed surveillance equipment on her property. 2 cameras pointed directly at our backyard. It was a blatant violation of privacy laws, and I wasn't going to let it slide. I took photos of the cameras and the hostile signs she had nailed to a tree, warning trespassers they would be fined for violating HOA regulations. What she didn't know was that her HOA was operating under shady financial practices I had ignored up until now. Grief is heavy, a weight that doesn't just lift but shifts, and in the midst of my pain, I felt something ignite within me. Justice was my fire, and Karen had just lit the match. The next morning, I made a quiet request. I didn't want to make a public spectacle of it, but I asked a trusted investigator to look into the HOA's financials and charter. What I expected to find were mismanaged funds and misplaced fines. What I didn't expect were wire fraud, elder abuse, and enough legal violations to fill a textbook. The HOA wasn't just poorly run, it was a private little kingdom, and Karen was its unstable queen. And now she had declared war on the United States government. The morning after the burial incident, the neighborhood felt different, quieter than usual, as if the air itself knew something had shifted. Karen's lawn ornaments, which had always stood in perfect formation like soldiers, were now askew. One flamingo had toppled over, as if it too had fainted from the drama. I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, eyes scanning the street as neighbors passed by a little faster than usual, some pretending not to see me, others ducking behind hedges. Word had gotten out, not just about Karen's 911 stunt, but about who I really was. A few neighbors gave half-hearted waves while others avoided eye contact. I didn't blame them. They were all under Karen's thumb, and for the first time, they realized that thumb might just be about to get crushed. But Karen wasn't backing down. No, she had doubled down. She went straight to the HOA forum and posted an accusation that made my blood run cold. She accused me of faking my government position. Karen's accusations in the HOA forum were almost too absurd to believe. She had claimed I was intimidating hardworking board members, and that Elijah had been terrorizing the block with military theatrics. I had to read her post 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. She had even uploaded blurry photos of Elijah holding a flag, adding dramatic captions like, "Suspicious youth in camo jacket, armed and dangerous." Someone commented, "Isn't that the Attorney General's son?" To which Karen quickly replied, "Not confirmed, could be crisis actors." That was the moment I realized Karen needed a legal wake-up call. I made the call to Roy, one of our quietest but most meticulous DOJ investigators. Roy was the kind of man who looked like a middle school math teacher and had the social skills of a houseplant. But give him a spreadsheet, a set of bylaws, in a few hours, and he could dismantle an empire by lunchtime. I didn't give him any specific instructions. I just told him to start with the finances of the HOA in Oak Ridge Estates, then poke around. No pressure. Roy simply nodded, disappearing into his world of coffee cups, files, and cryptic post-it notes. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't backing down. She called an emergency HOA meeting, passing out flyers door to door, wearing a vest and windbreaker as if she were running for office. The flyer read, "Community safety and neighborhood standards are under attack. Attend to protect our values." When I showed up with Elijah, the entire room turned to stare at us, like we had just kicked the door in. Karen stood at the front, gripping a wireless mic, trying to look calm, but her smile faltered when she saw us enter. She pressed on, her voice shaking with fake concern. "Neighbors," she began, "we need to talk about the misuse of property for unapproved events." She pointed at us dramatically. "There was an unauthorized funeral last week involving flags, weapons, and minors in distress. Our rules clearly state that no personal ceremonies can be held without HOA oversight." I raised my hand, calm but firm. "Our property is exempt from HOA governance. It's been on file with the county since 1979. You can look it up." Karen smirked. "Anyone can file something, doesn't make it legal. You'll need HOA clearance moving forward." That was when Elijah, standing beside me with a folder in hand, opened it and read aloud. "Here's the state exemption for family cemeteries on private land, signed and notarized. Here's the deed showing the HOA was formed 20 years after our property was established. And here's a court ruling confirming that cemeteries, especially military-affiliated ones, fall under federal protections. The room went silent. Someone in the back actually whispered, "Oh, wow." Karen turned red, her face twitching with frustration, but she quickly pivoted. "This isn't just about you, it's about everyone. I've received multiple complaints about noise, flags being lowered without permission, and frankly, the emotional impact on other residents." "Are you suggesting grief should be scheduled?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. Karen blinked, flustered, and then quickly changed tactics. "Let's vote," she said, trying to hurry. "All in favor of requiring pre-approval for any ceremonies, including but not limited to burials, memorials, flag displays, and gatherings of more than 4 people?" Only 2 hands went up, hers and a man who looked like he'd been promised a fruit basket. Karen's face fell, betrayed. "Well, the rest of you clearly don't care about the rules," she snapped. From the back of the room, a voice piped up. We didn't know we could ignore her before. Laughter rippled through the room. After the meeting, Roy called me. "You're going to want to see this," he said. "I'm emailing you some files." The files were explosive. The HOA's operating budget included expenses that made no sense. Catering from high-end restaurants, payments to a landscaping company that didn't exist, and random wire transfers to a personal PayPal account listed under community enrichment. It was clear that the HOA wasn't just poorly run. It was a private little kingdom, and Karen was its unstable queen. Roy had already matched the mysterious PayPal account to Karen's personal email address, confirming what we had suspected for weeks. The financial discrepancies in the HOA's budget were only the beginning. As it turned out, Karen had been funneling HOA funds to herself under various aliases. Payments were made to high-end restaurants for board lunches, payments to a landscaping company that didn't even exist, and random wire transfers to a PayPal account labeled Community Enrichment. But this wasn't the worst part. There was something far more sinister. Karen had hired a private company to install hidden cameras all over the neighborhood under the pretense of increasing security monitoring. These cameras were concealed in birdhouses, lawn lights, and even inside decorative mailboxes. What Karen didn't know, or perhaps didn't care to acknowledge, was that the footage from these cameras didn't go to local law enforcement or a neutral third party. No, it all went directly to her personal laptop. She had been spying on the residents, tracking their daily routines, recording private conversations on their porches, and even zooming in on children playing in their yards. This wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was criminal behavior. Roy flagged several legal violations, including unauthorized data collection, child privacy infringements, and the misuse of HOA funds. At this point, we were no longer dealing with a simple HOA tyrant. We were facing someone running a suburban surveillance state, using public money to fund her paranoid delusions. But I didn't act immediately. I wanted Karen to feel the pressure build up. I needed her to know that she was no longer in control, that the walls were closing in on her. The next few days were strangely calm. Karen didn't leave her house much, and when she did, she wore sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low, as if trying to hide from the world. Word began to spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once cowered under Karen's clipboard were now meeting in private, trading stories and comparing finds. One woman told me that Karen had fined her for unauthorized shade because her new umbrella cast a disruptive silhouette onto adjacent lots. Another man said his dog had been cited for excessive tail wagging. The absurdity of it all was both maddening and surreal. Meanwhile, Elijah was finding his way back to some semblance of peace. He spent hours tending to Matthew's resting place, planting flowers, and even building a small bench under the oak tree where his brother was laid to rest. He didn't talk much about what had happened, but his hands were steadier now, and that was enough for me. Elijah had lost his brother, then almost his dignity, but like the soil around Matthew's grave, he was slowly rooting himself again, beginning to heal. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. Her posts on the HOA website became increasingly unhinged. She accused me of planting spies in the neighborhood, tampering with property lines, and even claimed that the flag Elijah had placed on Matthew's grave was emitting low-frequency noise that disturbed local wildlife. At this point, she was trying to file HOA citations against a dead soldier. That was when I knew she wasn't just unhinged, she was dangerous. And that was when I made my move. Karen's descent into madness wasn't gradual. It was a full-on nosedive. Just days after her outburst at the emergency HOA meeting, she began issuing printed fines, stuffed into people's mailboxes, each one more absurd than the last. One neighbor was fined $75 for having overly reflective wind chimes. Another received a violation notice for unauthorized laughter after 9 p.m. The community, once held hostage by her clipboard and rulebook, now found itself caught between disbelief and dark humor. Still, there was an undercurrent of fear. As absurd as Karen's behavior had become, she still wielded power. Some residents whispered about the time she had a family's trampoline hauled away for excessive bouncing. But this time, Karen had picked the wrong target. Roy was calling with updates almost daily now, his voice calm and steady, a sharp contrast to the chaos he was uncovering. His latest findings made everything before it seem almost trivial. The private surveillance network Karen had installed throughout the neighborhood was far more invasive than we had imagined. Hidden microphones had been embedded inside decorative stones lining the community walking trail. One camera, disguised inside a bird feeder, was aimed directly into a couple's kitchen window. The footage wasn't stored on any HOA server or sent to a third-party security firm. Instead, Roy found evidence it was being saved on multiple encrypted hard drives he suspected Karen kept stashed in her attic, far from anything that could be publicly audited. This was no longer a matter of privacy violations. It was felony-level unauthorized surveillance. Recording private citizens without their consent, especially in intimate spaces or when minors were present, carried serious criminal penalties. Karen wasn't watching her neighbors for their safety. She was orchestrating a live-action reality show with herself as the sole director and audience. But the worst revelation was still to come. Roy managed to match up surveillance footage, timestamps with HOA citation records. That's when the full picture snapped into focus. Karen had been using the footage to track when people were away from their homes, on vacation, at work, or out for the day. During those windows, she would fabricate violations and submit fines. One man received a citation for leaving his trash bins out too long, even though he was out of town and the bins had been stored in his garage. Karen had walked onto his property, pulled the bins out herself, taken a photo, and submitted the evidence. I drove straight to the local precinct and asked to speak with the police chief, a man named Whitaker. He looked tired, eyes ringed with dark circles, when I arrived unannounced. When I laid the folder in front of him, labeled Operation Flamingo, he flipped through the first few pages, eyes widening. "She's finished," he muttered. He admitted they'd received Karen's complaints for years but could never act. "She buries us in paper," he sighed. "Noise complaints, imaginary fence disputes, unlicensed reindeer at Christmas. We had no idea she was running her own surveillance grid." And yet, Karen still wasn't done. In a move that genuinely stunned me, she mailed a cease and desist letter directly to the Department of Justice. She accused the DOJ of harassment, entrapment, and illegal overreach into sovereign community affairs. She underlined sovereign community 3 times. Roy forwarded me a scan of the letter with a subject line that simply read, "I think she thinks she's a country now." What Karen didn't know was that Roy had already secured a federal warrant. We had a quiet, tactical operation scheduled, a no-fanfare retrieval of surveillance equipment, financial records, and electronic data. The plan was clinical, precise. But I had something else in mind. This wasn't just about shutting Karen down. This was about shining a light on everything she had done, about giving her victims, our neighbors, a chance to speak. So I arranged for the next HOA meeting to be open to the entire community. We sent flyers by mail, hand-delivered some, and posted others on every community board we could find. Word spread quickly. By the time the evening arrived, the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center was packed, standing room only. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some angry, some nervous, but all curious. Karen, dressed in a loud magenta blouse and holding her usual clipboard, stood at the front of the room, trying to look composed. But even before the meeting began, the energy in the room had shifted. Her empire was unraveling, and for the first time she could feel it. Karen stood at the front of the room, microphone in hand, her usual smug expression stretched thin over a twitching jaw. She launched into her speech with the same inflated confidence she'd wielded for years, railing against the so-called creeping threat of government interference. But this time, her voice lacked the grip it once had. The room wasn't hanging on her words, it was waiting. I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and gently took the microphone from her hand. "Karen," I said, turning to face the crowd, "I think it's time your neighbors see what you've really been doing in their name." Behind me, the projector flickered to life, and the first image filled the screen, a spreadsheet of HOA funds, with thousands of dollars in unexplained transfers. The room went completely silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. The next image appeared, surveillance footage, zoomed in through a kitchen window, showing a neighbor in their own home, completely unaware they were being watched. Gasps erupted across the room. Then came the third image, a list of HOA citations issued while residents were clearly out of town, paired with screenshots of Karen manipulating trash bins, moving lawn furniture, or staging violations for the camera. Karen's face went pale. She stammered something about security measures and fake data, but her voice was drowned out by the murmurs growing louder. No one was listening to her anymore. One by one, people began to stand up. A woman described how Karen fined her teenage son for overgrown hair visible from the sidewalk. A man told the room he'd been harassed for owning a red car that clashed with the street's natural color palette. The room that had once sat in fearful silence under Karen's rule now roared to life with stories, frustrations, and finally, solidarity. That night, Roy executed the warrant. Federal agents arrived without sirens or spectacle, just quiet precision and authority. Karen's home was searched. Laptops, hard drives, surveillance devices, all boxed and tagged. The agents were polite but thorough. Karen, for the first time, didn't scream. She stood in her foyer, stunned, clutching a coffee mug that read, "I run this place." Not anymore. The official charges were still a few days out, but they were coming. Wire fraud, invasion of privacy, elder abuse. Roy had discovered that Karen had manipulated an elderly neighbor into signing over power of attorney, which she used to siphon funds into the HOA's so-called discretionary budget. That was the final nail. But before law enforcement could take her into custody, Karen made one last desperate move. She filed a civil lawsuit against me. Emotional distress. Reputational damage. The envelope was delivered, of course, by the HOA's former treasurer, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Elijah opened it over dinner and read it aloud, half in disbelief. "She says you ruined her life," he said. I looked at him, then out the window toward Matthew's tree. "She picked the wrong family," I said. "We've weathered the worst of it, but the storm's not over yet." Karen had always been delusional, but now she was wounded and cornered, and the next battle wouldn't be in a meeting room. It would be in court, and I was ready. Karen showed up to the first court hearing dressed like a substitute teacher who'd lost a fight with a clearance rack. She wore a beige skirt suit with shoulder pads so puffy they could have deployed on impact. In her hands, she clutched a manila folder like it contained nuclear codes. I almost laughed, not because of how she looked, but because of how she walked into the courtroom with the confidence of someone who still thought they were untouchable. She was about to learn otherwise. Karen strutted into the courthouse with the confidence of someone who had never faced real accountability. Her attorney, a man named Daryl, introduced himself, loudly and proudly, as a sovereign legal strategist, which was the first red flag. The second was his appearance. He wore a crooked bow tie, carried a briefcase covered in libertarian bumper stickers, and spoke almost entirely in sentence fragments. At one point, he referred to the United States government as the corporate entity formerly known as America. It was like watching two people try to out-delusion each other in front of a very real, very unimpressed federal judge. Karen's civil lawsuit was just as ludicrous as everything else she had done. She claimed I had used my federal position to psychologically terrorize a law-abiding citizen, accused Elijah of militant behavior with symbolic weaponry, and even tried to argue that her position as HOA president was equivalent to a federal appointment. The filing was riddled with typos, random capitalization, and used the word persecution 16 times. The judge, a seasoned woman with steel gray hair, sharp eyes, and no time for foolishness, read through the lawsuit slowly. She then peered over her glasses and asked dryly, "Miss Green, is this a prank?" Karen jumped to her feet, indignant. "Your Honor, I am the elected president of a sovereign neighborhood body. This woman brought federal interference into our community's spiritual core. The judge leaned back in her chair, clearly trying to maintain some level of professionalism. You called the police on a child during a funeral, she said, voice flat. That's irrelevant, Karen snapped. I felt unsafe. He was holding metal. That was a flagpole, I said from my seat, with folded colors from a fallen soldier's casket. Sharp ends, Karen added desperately. The judge held up her hand. Enough, we'll proceed. But I warn you, any more courtroom theatrics, and I'll hold you in contempt. Karen sank into her chair, muttering under her breath. Daryl leaned in and whispered something that made her nod as if he'd just revealed a brilliant legal strategy. Based on his later argument that HOA sovereignty exempted Karen from all federal laws, I suspected it was just more nonsense. When asked to cite legal precedent, Daryl said, the founding fathers wouldn't have wanted this. That went over about as well as you'd expect. Then it was my turn. I stood, calm and deliberate, and laid out the facts. I explained how Karen had abused her role, weaponized community rules, violated the privacy of dozens of residents, and, most painfully, falsely accused my teenage son of criminal activity during one of the most sacred moments of his life. I presented surveillance footage, financial records, and a thick folder of written statements from neighbors who had suffered under Karen's reign. But the moment that truly shifted the courtroom's tone came when Elijah took the stand. He wore a blazer 2 sizes too big, and his voice was soft but steady. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, an old kind of strength, earned far too young. He spoke about what it felt like to kneel beside his brother's grave and be surrounded by armed police, about the fear that gripped his chest, the shame he felt when hands were pointed at him, not in grief but in suspicion. All I did, he said, was love my brother. She tried to make it look like a crime. The courtroom was still. The tension was thick. Even the bailiff looked like he was blinking away something. Midway through Elijah's testimony, Karen tried to interrupt, objecting that it was emotionally manipulative. The judge narrowed her eyes. He's talking about burying his brother, she said coldly. You're talking about flower arrangements in mailboxes. Sit down. From that point on, Karen's grip on the room shattered. Karen spiraled completely during the final stretch of the trial. She interrupted constantly, yelling that the court was biased and that the legal system had been infiltrated by anti-HOA operatives. At one point, she tried to submit a printout from a conspiracy blog as evidence, complete with pixelated images, red arrows, and all-caps headlines. The judge didn't even glance at it, waving it off with the sort of disdain only years on the bench can perfect. But Karen wasn't finished. During closing statements, she stood up unprompted and announced she would be delivering what she called a citizen's declaration of rights. She began shouting about HOA independence, government corruption, and how the Constitution was never meant to limit community-based sovereignty. Then, in a moment that was both ironic and surreal, she attempted to rip up a printed copy of the U.S. Constitution. It didn't tear cleanly, just crumpled awkwardly in her hands. That was the final straw. The bailiff escorted her out immediately, and the judge fined her for disorderly conduct on the spot. There was no recess, no deliberation. The judge ruled in my favor without hesitation, dismissing Karen's lawsuit as both frivolous and malicious. She didn't stop there. The court imposed sanctions for her abuse of the legal system and referred Karen for further criminal investigation. As the gavel came down, I caught a glimpse of Karen's expression. Something shifted in her eyes. For the first time, the outrage melted into something quieter. Fear. The kind that creeps in when someone realizes the rules they've bent for years are finally bending back, and this time with consequences. And those consequences came quickly. That very afternoon, the Department of Justice officially filed charges. Karen was indicted on multiple counts: wire fraud, unlawful surveillance, harassment, elder exploitation, and obstruction of justice. By the next morning, her name was plastered across news outlets, local TV, national media, even suburban mom blogs. One headline read, HOA tyrant indicted by feds. Another simply said, Queen of Order falls. Reporters camped outside her home. Former HOA board members resigned en masse. One even called me, voice shaking, and said, I'm sorry, we were all scared of her. You did what none of us could. By the end of the week, Oak Ridge Estates HOA was officially dissolved. The board disbanded. All HOA funds were frozen. There was no one left to enforce Karen's draconian rules. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. Families tore down Karen's ridiculous notices from their mailboxes. One man, who had been fined every month for using a charcoal grill, threw a block-wide barbecue in celebration. Lawn chairs spilled into driveways. Kids played basketball until the sun disappeared behind the houses. Laughter returned, real laughter, the kind that no longer looked over its shoulder. As for Karen, she was arrested quietly, without any fanfare, while trying to sneak out through the back gate of her property. She had packed 2 suitcases, a flash drive, and a coffee mug that read, Queen of Order. Her mugshot hit the evening news by sunset. I didn't smile when I saw it, but I won't pretend I didn't feel satisfied. That night, Elijah and I sat beneath the oak tree, on the bench he had built beside Matthew's grave. The wind moved gently through the branches, rustling the leaves like a quiet applause. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. There was peace now, real peace. Not the kind written in the HOA bylaws, but the kind that comes from truth, from justice, and from the courage of a boy who refused to be broken. Before we went inside, Elijah looked at me and said, "She thought she owned this place." I nodded, but we never belonged to her. Karen's kingdom had fallen, not with a roar, but with a gavel. Karen Green's face, once the self-appointed symbol of order and neighborhood decorum, now stared blankly from a mugshot that would go viral before noon. Headlines ranged from deadpan to devastating. One called her the surveillance suburbanite, another dubbed her the dictator of driveways, and a particularly scathing article asked, "How many cameras does one HOA president need?" But no headline, no matter how clever, could truly capture the sheer absurdity of what she'd built, or how completely it had collapsed. Though the legal process would continue, the damage Karen had inflicted couldn't be undone in a single day. Her invasive policies had left deep scars, emotional and cultural. For years, the community had lived under a silent pressure, afraid to plant the wrong flowers, host a birthday party without written approval, or even let their dog bark too loudly. It was a culture of fear, suspicion, and conformity. But something changed after her arrest. At first, it was subtle. Porch lights stayed on longer into the night. Neighbors lingered in conversation rather than retreating behind closed doors. Fences that had once felt like barriers now looked like boundaries. People began reclaiming the space that had always been theirs. In the week that followed, I received dozens of handwritten letters. Some came from neighbors I'd barely spoken to. Others were from residents who had moved away just to escape Karen's reach. One was from an elderly woman who had never once dared to attend an HOA meeting. She thanked me for standing up. "You didn't just stop her," she wrote. "You reminded us we weren't crazy for wanting to live in peace." Elijah received letters too, mostly from teenagers. Many had seen what happened and, for the first time, felt seen themselves. One boy simply wrote, "You made me feel brave." But even amid healing, there were practical matters to handle. The old HOA office, an ugly beige building that looked like a DMV trying to be important, stood empty. With the organization dissolved and its assets seized, the property went up for auction. After a long talk with Elijah, I bought it. Not for revenge, but for purpose. We transformed it into a public memorial garden and named it Matthew's Peace. It wasn't flashy, just clean stone paths, quiet benches, and a circle of petunias Elijah insisted on planting, knowing full well how much Karen had hated them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Where once rules were written and fines sent, people now gathered to grieve, reflect, and breathe freely, without fear of a warning taped to their door. At the garden's dedication, the whole neighborhood came. Some brought flowers, others brought old HOA notices, which they shredded with satisfaction into a compost bin near the entrance. Kids chalked messages onto the path. "Freedom lives here. Thank you, Matthew. No more Karens." Elijah gave a short speech. His voice shook once, but he didn't talk about the funeral or the courtroom. He talked about Matthew, how he helped build a treehouse, tied knots, and snuck marshmallows before dinner. "He gave me courage," Elijah said, "and now I think I finally found a way to use it." After the ceremony, a former HOA board member, Lorraine, approached us with an envelope. "It's from Karen," she said, looking tired. "They let her send it from county." I almost threw it out, but curiosity won. Inside, scribbled in purple ink, was a letter that began, "I still hate petunias." It was everything I expected, and yet not. Rambling excuses, bitter denial. But one line stood out. Maybe I mistook control for safety. Maybe I built a wall where I should have planted a garden. I folded the letter, labeled it closure, and moved on. Karen was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. No parole, no speech, just a quiet courtroom filled with residents she had fined, surveilled, and silenced. When the gavel fell, no one cheered. We all just exhaled. Now the lawns aren't perfect. No one cares. Someone painted their house neon yellow and got a basket of lemons from the neighbors. Dogs bark. Kids play basketball after dark. Barbecues fill the air with smoke and laughter. Elijah speaks to veterans groups now, tells them about Matthew, about truth. He's become a quiet, steady light. I return to my work in Washington, a little more grounded, a little more aware of how power, even the small kind, can be a weapon or a lifeline. Matthew's peace remains open day and night. People come from other towns just to sit beneath the tree. They read the plaque that tells the story, not just of Matthew, but of what happens when a community finds its courage. At sunset, I sometimes find Elijah there, sitting quietly, listening to the wind. We lost a son. We nearly lost another to fear. But we reclaimed our peace and exposed the real threat hiding behind rules, roses, and HOA letterhead. Karen tried to rule by fear. But in the end, it was love, truth, and one boy's quiet resilience that brought her empire down, brick by brick.